Good evening and welcome to another week of Overtime here on WOTM. I am Gerhard Mathangani, joined by our expert historian / researcher, Mark Everett Kelly. Mark's normally in on Wednesdays. We brought him here on Monday. We'll have a nice little breakdown of the college football season as well as the Atlanta Braves. Let's also talk a little high school football as we get you ready for week 6 of the high school football season. We'll start though in college football. The Alabama Crimson Tide in a little tune-up game before we're going into the teeth of the SEC part of the schedule. They took on Southern Miss. It's a game that Alabama dominated from early on. You kind of wanted to see how they would bounce back after that game against Florida in the Swamp. Coach Saban didn't really love their performance there, but they came back and got a nice 63-14 win over Southern Miss, and now look ahead to a big game against Ole Miss. What did you see in this past week and some of the things that you're looking forward to now as Bama plays for the Rebels?
Well, when would you say was the last time Alabama fans were really worried about their stake in the SEC, that maybe another team could take over, especially the SEC West,
right,
and beat them at home? Maybe 2019, definitely going into that LSU game, there was thoughts that perhaps they could lose, but LSU's offense was historic. Ole Miss offense is getting to that point when you're looking at the fact that under Lane Kiffin, they've had 600 yards in 13 games. Okay. When compared to before he got there, it was only 1.3% of the time. Now it's 46% of the time. They're getting 600 yards or more in games. So their offense is something to be reckoned with. And everybody has that fear because of last year's close game at Ole Miss. I think that sent shockwaves throughout Alabama Nation that a team could make them look that bad on offense. And Ole Miss still has the same amount of weapons, minus Elijah Moore. But Antonio Drummond has stepped up right in his place. Where last year Moore led FBS in yards per game, Antonio Drummond is second this year. Could lead it just as well. And the only reason why it's yards per game was because Smith played more games. You know, Smith had caught him and passed him. Devontae had that, at halfway through the 2020 season. So I think that's why most Alabama people are feeling this week as opposed to any other week. Even though it's at home, they remember that maybe they're a little susceptible since they lost to LSU at home in a game that most thought that they probably wouldn't lose because of LSU's weakness on defense. Ole Miss has the same kind of characteristics. You know they could score, but can they stop Alabama?
Exactly. Southern Miss, that game was kind of what I think offensively was a kind of a precursor to what we were expecting to see in the game against Ole Miss. They scored 63 points on Saturday. They needed 63 points last year at Ole Miss to be able to come away with that win. 63-48 was the final score from Hemingway Stadium in Oxford. Bama head coach Nick Saban met the media today in his weekly press conference and talked about some of the things that he has seen so far from Ole Miss's offense this year.
This is one of the best offensive teams in the country, no doubt. The quarterback is a fantastic player, understands the offense well, does a great job of executing it. They've got really good running backs. They've got lots of speed. They've got good receivers. The offensive line is returning intact. So a lot of really good players that are really well coached, and their whole fastball system is something that's always a challenge for the defense to get lined up and play with great poise and be able to focus on doing your job. So it's a real challenge for us from that standpoint.
Of course, last year's game was incredible. We had a great matchup between Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin, and Lane Kiffin obviously brought some of the fastball style that Nick Saban likes to talk about, brought that to Alabama, where they changed the entire culture from last year, from the previous years, I should say. You'll have a graphic in just a little bit about the historical significance of what Ole Miss has been able to do over these last 4 years. But as you take a look at the clips from last year's game and some of the things you've noticed from this year, what stands out to you about Ole Miss and some of the things they'll need to do Saturday?
Here's a key thing about Ole Miss. They're averaging 7 yards per play, and that is only 7 teams since 2010 have averaged that many yards per play with 75 plays or more a game. They have 83 yards, 83 plays per game. That's usually, you don't usually average that many yards per play when you have that many plays in a game. So that's a good idea for how explosive this Ole Miss offense is. They have a high number of big plays. They're averaging 26 big plays per game, which means 10 or more yards per game, which is the most in the nation. So those are 2 ways that they can get at Alabama, which I think really scares most people that's going into this game. Is their quick strike ability that most teams can't keep up with Alabama and score with them. Ole Miss can.
Exactly, and they showed it last year. Meanwhile, let's bring up this graphic that you brought up earlier about what Lane Kiffin and just Ole Miss in general has been able to do over the course of the last 4 years. They've recruited, or they've had two coaches between Hugh Freeze and Lane Kiffin that run this up-tempo style, and I think it kind of serves them in the way they recruit. And just like you said, they've been able to put up big numbers in the process.
But they still have to stop Alabama,
right?
And they haven't been able to. As you look at the last 4 years, Alabama averaging almost 63 points per game. The last 4 games against Ole Miss, averaging around 580 yards per game. So Ole Miss still has to stop Alabama. From these last 4 years, they haven't.
Right.
And I don't really see any other reason why Alabama will not be able to score on them like they have. When you're averaging over 60 points per game in the last 4 games, and I haven't seen enough of Ole Miss defensively.
Right.
Yeah, they're playing a little better, but they haven't played the type of competition that you would need to play in order to show that you're much better than you were last year. To me, this has a lot of identifications of that LSU game. Two powerful offenses. Whose defense is going to crack the most?
Right.
And I think Alabama's got the better defense.
Exactly. And we'll pick this game coming up a little bit later in our program, so you want to stick around for that. Meanwhile, you talked about that Ole Miss defense. Yes, by statistics, it has improved. However, as you mentioned, it's not the same competition that they played last year when it was all SEC schedule, and we got to see the downfall of that defense really early on in the year. But head coach Alabama, Nick from Alabama, head coach, he talks about the defense for Ole Miss and what he has seen so far this year as compared to last.
Well, they just have a good system and a good scheme, and they've, I think they went and studied some things, and they do a good job of executing it. They know what they're doing, and their players are, really know what they're doing. I think, last year was a little bit of an anomaly when it came to, if you're a new staff, how do you get, what you want to do implemented? And I think, they probably went through that on defense a little bit, last year because of COVID. This year, because they've had the spring, they've had the summer, they've had a year to know what kind of adjustments they need to make relative to the players they have, and they've done a really good job of that.
So the Alabama game comes your way on Saturday. We'll talk a little bit more college football in a bit, but we want to also remind you that coming up later this week, we'll have our WOTM AHSAA Game of the Week. It is Oak Mountain versus Spain Park. That is Thursday night at 7 o'clock. You catch that once again on WOTM as well as My 68 WABM. And it's one of the great matchups in Class 7A, Region 3. Be sure to join us Thursday for that. Coming up next here on Overtime, we promise more college football. We'll get to more college football. Start with the Auburn Tigers. Also talk the new college football polls and what stood out on Saturday. That and more coming up next.